Welcome to Kidsfishing.
Welcome to this episode of Kidsfishing, and today we're going to be talking about the secrets of fishing line. Recently I purchased some fluorocarbon, the Berkeley Pro Spec range, and I'm going to put this on my own fishing line, and I thought it would be an ideal opportunity to talk about the different types of fishing line and just why you choose a specific type. Now, when you are going to purchase fishing line, certainly as a beginner, but even as a more experienced fisherman or fisher person, there's an absolute armada of different fishing lines, and when you start to look at some of the international brands as well, there's just so many to choose from and it can get quite confusing. So I thought I'd talk about the basics of choosing between monofilament nylon, fluorocarbon and braid, and why you choose different types of line and what their pros and cons are. So firstly, let's talk about monofilament nylon, and this is the tried, true and tested old fisherman's friend. Now, nylon's been around, or mono as it's called, has been around for a long time, and in fact it's still used a lot. And one of the pros for mono is that it's really cheap. It's a great line if you're looking for a budget line. So a couple of things to think about with mono. One is it is very cheap. It stretches, so it stretches up to 25%. Now, there are pros and cons for having a line stretch, but you need to think about that in terms of your ability to feel the fish and respond to a fish. If there's 25% elasticity in your line, it's not going to be quite as easy to feel a fish bite, and then the strike is also going to be less effective as well. Also, mono floats to a certain degree as well, so that means if you're looking to try and get your line down very quickly to the bottom of either a lake or salt water, it tends to float and not sink as fast. Also, it does tend to wear as well, so it abrades on rocks and it gets damaged, and also the sun affects it over a period of time as well. So let's talk about braid next. Braid is another alternative choice when you're looking at fishing lines, and it's particularly good when you're looking for a line that is very strong and lightweight. Braid, in terms of price point, is probably mid-tier range compared to fluorocarbons and mono. So it's not cheap, but it's not super expensive as well, depending on what type of brand you're buying, of course. The advantages with braid are it's strong, it doesn't have the flexibility or elasticity of nylon, and the advantage with that, and there is a con to that as well, is that because it doesn't have the elasticity, you can feel the fish and there is no stretch in the line, so it means that when you strike or when the fish bites, you can really sense what is going on quite easily, as opposed to the stretch in mono. The disadvantage with that lack of elasticity is that if you have a large shock in the line, so a very big fish striking the line, then there is no give in the line, which means that potentially there's an opportunity to break off or for the hook to actually be ripped right out of the fish. So that's something to think about depending on what you're fishing for. Some of the other things to think about with braid is that it's very difficult to break. It's a lot harder to break than, say, mono nylon, which means that if you get a snag on the rocks, or if you're rock fishing, or if there are snags, lake bottoms and things like that, and you have no way of getting the snag off, it's very difficult to break, and in fact you'll probably break your rod before you break the line, so you need to be a little bit careful about that and consider what are the snag potentials. Braid is also very durable in comparison to mono, and it's not affected by sunlight like mono is, so if you look after your braid, it can last literally a lifetime, especially if you're using it for backing on your reel. Now, in comparison to mono nylon, braid sinks, so it goes down to the bottom, it doesn't float like mono, so that's a consideration as to where you are going to be fishing in the water table, water level, and whether you're likely to have the line drop onto snags. Fluorocarbon is another line option, and it's the most expensive of the three options to choose, but it does have some great benefits. One of those is that it's very difficult to see in the water. It's much harder to see than mono, which means that you can actually increase the weight or test breaking strain of the line relative to the diameter, and therefore put heavier line in the water and still make it difficult for the fish to see it in comparison to mono. So it has great visibility or invisibility to fish. Fluorocarbon sinks more readily than mono, so it doesn't sit on the top like mono. Fluorocarbon is more durable than mono, but probably less than braid in comparison. It has more durability and resistance to breaking down in sunlight. Fluorocarbon also stretches a lot less than mono. It's not quite as inelastic as braid, but it's certainly a lot less elastic than mono, so there's not a lot of stretch in fluorocarbon. And there is obviously pros and cons for having that. Now, a lot of people use fluorocarbon as a leader for their fishing lines, so they'll either have braid and then fluorocarbon, or they might have nylon and then fluorocarbon. And the reason being is that it's very difficult to see. Fluorocarbon is strong and durable as well, so it's less likely to break. I looked at the price of fluorocarbon, mono and braid, and I did a price comparison per meter, looking at the variation in prices for obviously for different types of brands, but in general nylon or mono is only about half a cent a meter, so it's very cheap in comparison to braid, which is somewhere between 22 cents and 40 cents per meter, whereas fluorocarbon is between about 40 cents and 96 cents per meter, and that's in New Zealand dollars. So it gives you a relative idea of price comparison in terms of bang for buck. Obviously the pros and cons for the different types of lines is the reasons why you would purchase them, but when you look at the cost of nylon per meter, it's very cheap, and therefore it's a great type of line for beginners to use when they are breaking line off, or when they are wanting something in a budget context to fish with. When you're looking to choose between different types of fluorocarbon or monofilament, and you're trying to work out which is the better product, and you have two brands for say monofilament, and they are both 10-pound breaking strain, but one of them is a thinner diameter, then the advantage with that particular line is going to be that it's harder for the fish to see it. And in fact, that's one of the advantages with fluorocarbon, is that you can actually put a thicker or larger diameter line in the water without the fish seeing it. So that's why fluorocarbon leaders are great. But diameter is the key thing to consider, mainly because you don't want the fish to see it, but also the thicker the diameter of the line, it will then have an impact on casting, and also how much line you can spool on your reel as well. So line diameter is a key consideration, and ideally the thinner the diameter you can get away with, the better, because it's going to be lighter to cast, which means your casts are going to go further, and also it's going to be harder for the fish to see. So I guess a good question to ask is, should a beginner use either braid or fluorocarbon as opposed to mono? And I guess the answer to that is it kind of depends on the fishing that they're doing. If they're doing boat fishing or vertical fishing down into the water, then they can get away with using braid because there's less opportunity for them to snag the line potentially. Fluorocarbon is really expensive, but it's a great leader line, so they could use it as their final leader and attach it to either braid or mono. But when you compare the price per meter for the three, monofilament nylon is incredibly cheap, and therefore it's a great option choice for beginner fishermen, and especially children, because they tend to trash their gear. So using mono for beginners and especially young children is a great choice because you don't have to worry about them mistreating their gear. When you're deciding how much money to spend on line, a good way to think about it is that the line is the thing that connects you to the fish. So if you scrimp and save on cheap line, then that's going to be the weakest link between you and the fish. And rather than maybe spending a bit of extra money on a rod, maybe it's a good idea to spend a little bit more money on a great line, whether it's fluorocarbon, whether it's braid, or maybe a top-end monofilament. When should beginners start using braid or fluorocarbon, or should they just stick to mono? What are your thoughts? Tell me what you think and leave your comments below. If this is your first time to kids fishing, then I invite you to subscribe for more fishing tips and tricks and to follow our kids fishing adventures. Thanks for watching this episode of
Kids Fishing.